This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace. To celebrate the film, let's learn more about one of its most iconic scenes, the Boonta Eve Classic, or put more simply, the pod race. Here's a rundown of every pod racer, going from the bottom of the list up to the winner. Ben Quadras was a Toong from the planet Toond. He competed in amateur circuits and performed well enough to earn a spot in the Boonta Eve Classic, but compared to the other racers, he was untested. He piloted a rented Boonta Trabot BT310 Quadra pod racer that was unfortunately sabotaged before the race even began. Fellow racer Roose accidentally damaged Quadras' pod, believing it belonged to Anakin Skywalker. As a result, Ben didn't even make it across the starting line of the race, and his rented T990 Mark II engines exploded, which may have cost him more than 14,000 credits. But Quadras didn't let the embarrassment ruin his career. He continued racing, and by the time of the Clone Wars had developed a rivalry with Sebulba that one poster called the sport's greatest. Majic was a Grand from the planet Hawk. He competed in the Boonta Eve Classic, piloting a GPE 3130 pod racer powered by two Thrustmaster 9000 Aerospike rocket engines and two smaller ramjet engines. Majic was also a pod racer parts dealer and had a reputation as being good-natured unless Sebulba were around. The negative feelings seemed to be mutual as Sebulba knocked Majic into a canyon wall during the Boonta Eve Classic, marking the first crash of the race. Majic survived, and legend stories say he was so angry he placed bounties on not only Sebulba but also his family. The Grand continued racing until his rival destroyed another one of his pods, after which Majic disappeared. Ratz Tyrell was an Alina pod racer from the somewhat primitive planet Aline. Many natives of his home considered Ratz to be the most famous being from their world. Overcompensating for his small size, Tyrell piloted two massive Volkov-Strude Titan 2150 rocket engines attached to his pod, which he named Skatalpin after a deadly creature from his homeworld. He toured the pod racing circuit with Alina mechanics as well as his family, a wife and 3 young children. Unfortunately, they witnessed the final race of Ratz Tyrell, who was the only pod racer to perish in the Boonta Eve Classic, crashing the Skatalpin into a stalactite in the Laguna Caves. His family and all of Aline mourned his death, and his son Deland would grow up to found the Ratz Tyrell Foundation, which worked to educate the public about the criminal dealings that surrounded pod racing. His efforts resulted in the sport being outlawed by the core worlds, leading to a decline across the galaxy. Mandrell was an Urkit from the planet Tatooine. He grew up watching pod racing and longed to become a pilot himself. By the time of Boonta Eve, 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, he had achieved his dream at a young age. As a teenager, he piloted Exelbrock XL 5115 engines. He also had a record-setting pit droid crew, but they would prove to be his downfall during the race when one of them was sucked into an engine after the first lap. According to legend stories, Odie stayed on Tatooine and worked at the Mos Espa Grand Arena. Months after the end of the Galactic Civil War, he helped Luke Skywalker learn more about his father Anakin. Years after that, he would also aid Han and Leia Organa Solo on a similar mission. Gleg Holdfast was a Nosarian from New Plimto. He was a pod racer seen in the Boonta Eve Classic, but he was perhaps better known as a sports journalist. He primarily used his access as a racer to gather gossip and news that would benefit his writing career. Despite this, he was still prideful, wearing various medals he had supposedly won in other competitions. He piloted a Voltec KT-9 Wasp that sported 2 KVT Series 400 high-thrust fan jet engines. During the Boonta Eve, Sebulba used his flamethrower to destroy Holdfast's pod. After recovering from his many injuries, Gleg used the access granted to him as a journalist to alter the records of the race, falsely claiming that he completed the course in 7th place. Nevaki was a gremlin from the movie Gremlins. Oh wait, no, he was a Zamster from the planet Zagoba. He piloted a Farwan and Glot 8T8 twin-block 2 special pod racer that another anonymous pilot claimed only an insane person would actually fly. It was unique from most of the other racers in that the cockpit was placed in front of the engines, making it far more dangerous. It's possible Nevaki's critics may have been right because the Boonta Eve Classic was his final race. His pod supposedly went off course to find a shortcut during the 2nd lap, where it disappeared. For a long time it was thought Key perished, but leaked holo footage revealed that the bounty hunter Aura Singh may have been responsible for his disappearance. Mars Guo was a Bardotan from the planet Fu. Interestingly, he was originally identified as a Fui from the planet Fu, but the Clone Wars episode that disappeared introduced the Bardotan people who were based on Mars Guo's design. Anyway, he piloted 2 massive Plug-2 behemoth engines in the Boonta Eve Classic. According to legend stories, the night before the race he was caught flirting with one of Sebulba's masseuses, which led to the Dug sabotaging Guo's engines. But I guess he didn't sabotage them enough because Mars kept pace with him throughout the 2nd lap. Sebulba finished finished the job by tossing some debris into the pod, causing the engines to explode. Guo survived the crash and eventually raced again. Team Topagales was a Vecnoid from Munis Mandrell. He was supposedly exiled from his home for being too handsome. Seriously, a princess wanted to marry him and he turned her down, so he was cast out and became a drunkard. Legend has it that he tried pod racing after developing a death wish, but there he found peace. He piloted an IPG X1131 Longtail pod racer, which featured the longest engine seen in the Boonta Eve Classic. He claimed to like Anakin Skywalker, but still bumped into the boy multiple times during the race. But he very well may have been drunk. During the second lap, his engines were shot by Tusken Raiders, which sent his cockpit spinning out of control. The crash apparently melted his ears off. He returned to racing and continued sustaining injuries, like the loss of one of his eyes, thanks to dangerous and perhaps drunken stunts. Over 5 decades after the Boonta Eve Classic, he worked alongside Odi Mandrell at the Mos Espa Grand Arena. Sandage was a Devlik from the planet Ord Radama. He piloted Turbodyne 99U engines, and he was not a good pod racer. Seriously, that's canon. A reference book called Star Wars Geektionary, The Galaxy from A to Z, straight up says Sandage was not a very good pod racer. Legend sources say he was a talented racer on his home world, but when he was on a different planet, he would easily become disoriented and lose his sense of direction, which is exactly what you want in a racer. Hoping to give himself a better chance of winning a race, he hired Aldar to murder Sebulba. They of course failed, and Sandage himself wound up veering off course where he crashed into a Jawa sandcrawler. He died 3 years later, but his son, Sandage Jr., more successfully continued his father's legacy as a racer. Dud Bolt was a Volptarine from the planet Volptar who was not only a pod racer pilot, but also a hitman, weirdly making him one of the 2 assassin pilots that raced in the Boonta Eve Classic. His pod was a Volptarine 327 from his homeworld. Despite being a competitor of Sebulba's, he was also paid to be the Dug's mid-race bodyguard, keeping him safe from the likes of Aldar and Sandage, who wanted him dead. During the race, he was unsuccessful in that regard, failing to keep pace with Sebulba, eventually crashing into a fellow racer. Bolt was taken to a med center where he recovered from his injuries and went on to continue his racing career. 10 years later, he was seen on the HoloNet racing on the planet Ando Prime. Ark Bumpy Roose was a Nucknog from the planet Sump. Okay, come on, they're not even trying with these names now. But Bumpy earned his nickname for his aggressive piloting style, knocking into his opponents, which would often result in simply injuring himself instead. He was not considered to be very bright in the eyes of the other racers. According to Star Wars legends, after nearly losing a race to the human Anakin Skywalker, Roose attempted to sabotage the child's pod racer before the Boonta Eve Classic, but he was unfamiliar with Anakin's craft and accidentally sabotaged Ben Quadaneros' pod instead. Ark did not finish the race after Dud Bolt crashed into his Vokov-Strude Plug 8G927 cluster array pod racer. It's unclear if he continued racing, but years later wound up being on the same transport that delivered Obi-Wan Kenobi and the son of Anakin Skywalker to Tatooine. Sebulba was a Dug from the planet Malastare, where pod racing was known to be especially fast and dangerous. He piloted a custom pod racer made up of 2 large orange Kalor Pondrat Plug F Mammoth Split X engines. Sebulba was a vicious opponent, using several weapons hidden in his racer to gain an advantage, including a flamethrower, a buzzsaw, a nail shooter, ion disruptors, and magma spikes. Or when all else failed, he wasn't above throwing debris into another racer's engines or simply sabotaging another pod before a race, even if it belonged to a child. Despite his best efforts, Sebulba did not finish the Boonta Eve Classic, crashing his pod racer near the finish line, losing to the human Anakin Skywalker. The Dug continued his racing career well beyond the Clone Wars. Posters advertised races featuring him, and his autograph was highly sought after. After the end of the Galactic Civil War, Sebulba had shifted his career to become a battle racer, and during a competition actually teamed up with Lando Calrissian and his other opponents to fight an Imperial Remnant Star Destroyer. Bull's Roar was a Sneevil from the planet Sneeve. He was known as a highly skilled pilot, flying his Benghazi Quadrajet 4-barrel 904E racing engines to victory in 2 prior Boonta Eve Classics. In Star Wars Legends, he was also a talented and celebrated musician, selling out million-seat venues on Coruscant as a singer. By the time of the Phantom Menace, he strongly favored his musical career, letting his racer fall into disrepair. Even so, he decided to race in the Boonta Eve Classic once more. He put on a show the night before the race and successfully completed the race in 6th place, which is more than most of the other racers can say. He largely retired from pod racing after that, but would occasionally participate in charity events. Elon Mack was a Flugrian from the planet Plu 4. Next to nothing is known about him in canon sources, but in Star Wars Legends, the name Elon Mack was an alias for his true name, Cam Nail. Wow, very clever. In those stories, his father was murdered by Aldar Beto, who was an assassin as well as a podracer. With no pod racing experience, Nail signed up for the Boonta Eve Classic, hoping to avenge his father's death by shooting Beto in the middle of the race. He failed to do so, but wound up finishing 5th, which awakened a love for the sport within him. He kept the name Elon Mack and continued to chase Beto through the racing circuit. He eventually captured Aldar, but his quarry escaped and Cam Nail's true identity was exposed. eIndicot was a Triffian from the planet Triffus. Barely anything is known about him in canon, except for the fact that he finished 4th in the race, so good for him. In Legends, he was originally a delivery man with a death wish, driving like a madman to drop off his packages. Eventually, he switched careers to pod racing, which seemed like a natural fit. He piloted J930-8 engines, winning several championships before competing in the Boonta Eve Classic. 10 years after claiming 4th place, he had apparently become a lawyer, adding the title Esquire to his name, but he also continued his successful career as a pod racer. Aldar Beto was a Glimphid from the planet Plu 2. In addition to being a talented pod racer, he was also known to be an assassin and bounty hunter, earning him the nickname Hitman on the pod racing circuit. Like many of his peers, he was willing to cheat or even kill to win. Before the Boonta Eve Classic, he conspired with fellow racer Sandage to murder Sebulba, but failed after 3 individual attempts. In the race, Beto expertly piloted Manta Ram Air Mark IV flat twin turbojets, earning him a respectable 3rd place. Legend stories claim Aldar continued his pod racing career for at least another decade and even teamed up with his old target Sebulba. Gasgano was a Zecto from the planet Troikan. As a well-known professional racer, he flew an Ord Pedrovia model pod. His 4 arms and 24 fingers gave him an advantage in races, allowing him extra control over his craft, which helped him finish 2nd place in the competition behind Anakin Skywalker. Legend sources state that Gasgano was at least somewhat more honorable than racers like Sebulba, preferring to win on merit alone rather than by destroying his competitors' pods. While not fully confirmed, the canon reference book Complete Legends makes mention of a multi-fingered former pod racer turned pickpocket present at the Mos Eisley Cantina when Luke Skywalker met Han Solo. So it's possible Gasgano fell on hard times in the decades that followed the Boonta Eve. Anakin Skywalker was a 9-year-old human slave that entered the Boonta Eve Classic very late. He was somewhat known among members of the pod racing circuit, including Sebulba, who for some reason hated the child so much he tried to kill him. But in defiance of all odds, the young boy won the race against several professional competitors, and then he simply disappeared off Tatooine. Rumors suggest that he won his freedom and became a Jedi, which is of course absurd. Anakin was the only human known to compete in pod racing. Although, interestingly, there was another young man, also by the name of Skywalker, that inadvertently performed very well in a pod race over 5 decades after the disappearance of Anakin Skywalker. That's curious. I wonder if they're related. But anyway, the final results of the Boonta Eve Classic were Anakin Skywalker in 1st place, Gasgano in 2nd, Aldar Beto in 3rd, eIndicot in 4th, Elon Mack in 5th, and Bull's Roar in 6th. The rest did not finish, and Ratz Tyrell died. But those are all 18 pod racers from the Phantom Menace that competed in the race. Let me know who your favorite is in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel to see more comprehensive Star Wars videos like this, follow us on our socials, and consider checking out our Patreon page for even more Star Wars talk. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.